Hello everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at using a Flask server to act as our socket server in a Rails application. So what we're going to be doing is having a Rails app right here. It'll have some front-end logic. This front-end logic will say, okay, well I got to send or receive a message. That message then gets sent or received to or from the backend Flask server. Then that Flask server, the Python app, says, all right, good to go here. I'm going to send it back. And you can see it getting console logged out here. You can see it hitting the app the Flask app here. And you can of course see the Rails app running right here. So this is sort of the setup that we have here. The reason why we're doing this is because I tried to get AnyCable up and running earlier today, and I wasted probably 5 hours of my life that I'm never going to get back because I couldn't get it to work. And their example app and their docs really weren't doing it for me. And eventually I just went, you know what, let's just see if we can run our own thing, because that seems like it's far more fun. And probably closer to something I would do in the real world anyways. So to get started, we're going to go ahead and create a new directory. I'm going to say make dir, and I'll just call it, or I guess we can just do a Rails new. Just do a Rails new video. And for this, I'm going to do a -j of ESBuild, a -c of Bootstrap, and then we'll cd into this. We can then run a code dot after we do all of that to hopefully get all of this set up. Now for the Flask portion, if you're not familiar, basically all you really have to do is make sure that you have Flask installed. Make sure you can run like a Python 3 command to run a Flask file. At that point, you're pretty much good to go. So if you don't know how to do this, just like go over to Google and like, I don't know, setting up Flask or something, and just find a setup instruction guide for your operating system. It's pretty straightforward. You usually just pip install it and it works out of the box. Sometimes you run into some weird stuff though. But okay, we're going to use this, which means I'm going to have to cd out of this and cd into that video project we just made. Once we're in this video project over here on the right side, I'm going to right click new file, call this the flask_server.py. You can of course call this whatever you would like to. I don't care. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. If you've never written a Python application before, it's going to look very similar to what you do in a Rails app. First thing you need to know is we're importing Flask, which means we're going to have to pip install it. We're also grabbing Flask socket.io, which means you're going to have to make sure that dependency is also installed. We're then going to create an app. This app is going to be a Flask with a name. We then give it a socket.io with a CORS policy. We pass in the app that we just made into the socket.io, and then we give it the CORS allowed origins. You can change this if you want to whatever the IP address is that you're running off of. In my case, it would be port 3000 for the Rails server, or you can leave it as an asterisk in case you want anyone in the world to be able to connect to your WebSocket, which is probably not a good idea, but I'm going to show you to do that anyways. We're then going to create a couple routes here, mostly just for testing purposes, but also for using purposes. First one's going to be the root of our application. It's just an index page that returns hello world. We can, of course, come into the terminal now and run a Python 3-m Flask server. We should be good to go. So we'll see it's running on port 5000. If we come over to port 5000, we can see hello world is printing to the page because we have hello world right here in our index action. Now that's done, let's go ahead and let's create the route for our socket.io stuff. Pretty straightforward. It's just going to be another @route with a /socket.io. It's just going to print it out to the screen. We can of course come over to localhost port 5000 /socket.io. It'll tell us that wasn't found, but that's okay. We can just stop our server and restart it. Come over here and refresh, and now we'll see socket.io on the screen. Cool stuff. Next, we can add a couple more. One will be for a connect. Just whenever we get a connect, we emit a message saying you've connected. Whenever we get a disconnect, we can do the same thing, but we just print a client disconnected instead. You can, of course, refactor that as needed. And then whenever we get a message, we can say handle this message. We want to print the received message, whatever that was. We'll then print a broadcasting thing to the terminal, and then we'll emit that message, which means it'll go out to everyone. After all of that, we just make sure that we're running this. We can then stop the server, come over here and restart, hit Control-Shift-R to refresh. This looks like it's working. Let's now come over to our Rails app. Oops, I have to clear the terminal. And in our Rails app, because we did the -j ESBuild, we now have a proc file as well as a package.json, wherever that is, right here. So in our package.json, there is something we have to add, which means I have to go find it in my other notes. We need to do a yarn add. Get F11 and zoom in a bit. A yarn add for socket.io-client. Go ahead and run that. That should hopefully work. And that should hopefully take care of that as well. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and let's generate a controller. We'll do a Rails G controller pages home. We can then also do a Rails G stimulus, and you can call this whatever you would like. I'm going to call mine the socket controller, and that should be good. Let's now go ahead and do I have to do a gem install foreman because I'm using a different version of Ruby, and then we can do a bin/dev to start our server. Should hopefully start it up. We can come over to localhost port 3000, refresh, and we'll get to this lovely page. You now come up to config and routes.rb. In our routes.rb, we want to change the get to a root and the slash to a hash because we want the root of our application to be the pages controller home action. And you can set up a route for this Flask application. We'll match a socket.io / whatever the path is to a Flask _ server controller and a forward socket or forward WebSocket action via all. And what this will allow us to do is come into our app, our controllers, right click new file, and we'll say this is the Flask _ server _controller.rb. And then in here, the first thing we want to do is require a REST client, which means we'll come down to our gem file and we'll add this to at the bottom of our gem file real quick. Not sure if this is needed, but it works for me. So we're going to go ahead and do this. We can stop the server, run a bundle install command to install this gem, and then we're good to do a bin/dev again. And then come over here in full screen, come back over to our Flask server. In here, what we're going to do is create a class for this controller, extends the application controller. We then want to do a def for the forward WebSocket, which is that action we were referencing right here. So we're using the Flask server controller and the forward WebSocket action. In here, what we're going to do is set the IP, which in this case, or the URL, which in this case is HTTP localhost port 5000, because in our Flask server, we told it to run on localhost and port 5000. And then after we have that, we just have to get a response from it. We can do that by calling REST client.execute. And then in here, we can start by passing in the request method. We can then do the URL. We can pass in some headers. And these headers, I'm actually not going to let GitHub Copilot do this because it's probably going to be too much. The headers are just going to be a content type of application/JSON. We can then do a payload, whatever that may be, by calling request.body.read. And then once all of that's done, we can render this out by calling render body response.body with a status of response.code. Go ahead and save that. And now we can come over to our pages controller. And inside our pages controller, it's not our pages controller, we can come into our views and our pages controller, but our home action right here, or our home view. We want to set up that stimulus controller we created, which is an app JavaScript controllers socket controller. We can do that by creating a div with a data-controller equal to socket, because the first word here is socket. Go ahead and save that. Now come into the socket controller specifically. And in here, we can start by importing that thing we added earlier, which is that IO from socket.io. We'll then come into our connect method, do a console.log to say this is connected, just so that we can make sure we're actually seeing this on the page. We can hit Control-Shift-I, and in our terminal, we should see socket connected because that's what we're printing out right here. Now that we have that, let's go ahead and let's create a couple events. We can just say, all right, so if the socket is socket.onConnect, we then want to do a console log saying we've connected to the WebSocket server. We can come over here and refresh, and hopefully we'll see error connecting, socket is not defined. So the socket right here means we have to actually define this. So what we're going to do for that, because we're importing IO, is we're going to pass in the same URL that we have right here, which is our socket.io URL. We can just do that right here, where we say const socket equals IO, and then we pass in that URL. If we refresh, you'll see we are now connected to the server. We can come over here. You're really not going to see much, but if we refresh the page again, you can hopefully see transport, blah, blah, blah. All of that's appearing in our Flask server whenever we refresh this page. So we can at least verify that something's happening on the Flask server in response to what's happening over here. We can then do a message received. We can say we received a message from the server. We can save this, come over here and refresh. You can see we received a message from the server saying connected, and then we connected to the WebSocket server. You do the same thing for disconnecting. I don't think we have any logic set up for that, but you could set it up if you wanted to. Just change the Flask file a little bit. We can then do, if you want to, something for emitting a custom event. We hit F11, where whatever your custom event is, you do the same thing. You just emit it, custom event, and then whatever it has in there. And finally, what we can do is we can make sure that this works on an interval. We can pass in, or we can set a set interval where we pass in a socket.send, say hello server every 3000 milliseconds, which is every 3 seconds. We can now come over here and refresh, and you should be able to see down here, every couple of seconds, we'll see something print out to the screen here. We receive the message, hello server, and we broadcast it. We come back over to our Flask server. You can see here, we receive a message from the server on a message. And again, in our controller here, this is doing the socket.send, and it's passing in the hello server. So when the server receives the message, when it gets a message, it prints received message. It then says broadcasting message, which is this next part right here. And then it emits that message, which is this part right here. And then again, after it emits it, it'll receive another one and it'll keep going indefinitely. And this is effectively how you can set up something like this. Now, at this point, you would have to set up like your database or whatever, however you want to handle this to make sure it's working appropriately. But that's more of a Flask specific tutorial and not necessarily a Rails tutorial, right? Because at this point, you just have like a backend here that has a socket.io instance running on it. And then you just kind of have to hook this up to whatever you want it to, whether that's like a Redis database or I don't know, whatever you want to use. I'm not going to tell you how to live your life. But this will allow you to communicate between these two applications using your WebSocket of choice. But yeah, that's going to do it for me. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.